They fined me $250,000 for saving their homes. Let that sink in. $250,000 for trying to keep an entire neighborhood dry. The letter arrived on a gray morning, slipped through the mail slot like any other piece of junk mail. But the paper felt heavier, thicker, the kind of official stock that makes your stomach twist before you've even read the first line. I tore it open at the kitchen counter, coffee still steaming beside me, and when I saw the number, my hands actually shook. $250,000 for an unauthorized hydraulic structure, their words. To them, my dam wasn't flood protection. It was a violation. I remember Laura walking in just as I froze over the page. She saw my face before she saw the letter, and her mug slipped right out of her hand. Shattered ceramic and hot coffee across the tiles, neither of us moving to clean it. We just sat at the table, staring at that paper like it was a death sentence. The thing that stung most was the timing. 2 weeks earlier, the neighborhood had faced the heaviest November rain in 20 years, 8 inches in a single night. But for the first time in decades, Riverside Gardens stayed dry. No cars floating, no basements ruined, no kids evacuated in rubber boats. 32 families were safe because of the dam I built. Mrs. Peterson even called me a hero when she handed me a plate of cookies. Neighbors smiled, thanked me at the mailbox, shook my hand in the street. For a short while, I believed I'd finally found peace in this so-called community. And then came Deborah Lewis, HOA president, professional smile, iron grip on every detail of our lives. She stood on my porch later that week, neat suit, clipboard clutched like a weapon, voice syrupy with false sympathy. "Scott," she said, "I know this fine feels harsh, but my hands are tied. County codes, environmental risk." She made it sound like she was grieving with me. But when she thought I wasn't looking, I caught the flicker in her eyes. Cold calculation, almost satisfaction. It didn't add up. I'd filed permits, followed process, pulled every county approval. This wasn't some backyard experiment with sandbags and duct tape. I'd spent $37,000 of my own retirement savings designing a system that met professional specs. Gates, retention ponds, reinforced barriers. I'd done this work for cities my entire career. Yet suddenly, the same county that had stamped every form was telling me I owed $250,000 for unauthorized construction. That night when the house was dark and Laura finally asleep, I sat alone at the kitchen table and unfolded the letter again. Studied every line, every seal, every legal phrase. Something about it gnawed at me. The formatting, the wording, it wasn't right. And then, as if the universe wanted to twist the knife, I found another envelope in the mailbox the next evening. No return address, no postmark. Just my name, block letters scratched in black ink. Inside, a single sheet. 5 words underlined twice. "Deborah Lewis is not what she seems." The rest of the message spelled out a truth I didn't want to believe. "The environmental documents are completely fake. Watch her behavior carefully. You're not fighting alone. A friend." I read it 3 times, my pulse hammering in my ears. Someone was watching the same things I was, and they weren't just guessing. They knew. They had access. That both terrified and relieved me. Because if Deborah's paperwork was fake, then this fine wasn't just unfair, it was criminal. The next morning, as I pulled on my boots by the door, the neighborhood was waking up around me. A gate creaked somewhere down the street, that long drawn-out groan of metal hinges that hadn't been oiled in years. I watched Mr. Williams shuffle past with his dog, offering me the awkward half-nod neighbors give when they've heard rumors but don't want to admit it. The air felt heavy, not just with damp from last night's rain, but with something unspoken. People knew something was brewing. And sure enough, Deborah showed up again. This time she didn't look smug. She looked nervous, wringing her hands, voice breaking in just the right places. "Scott, I want you to know I admire what you've done, but regulations are regulations." She played the part so well I almost believed her. Almost. Because when she glanced away for a fraction of a second, the mask slipped again. A tiny twitch of contempt, hatred. She caught herself fast, but I'd seen it. That was when the truth hit me like a cold wave. This wasn't about safety. This wasn't about codes. This was about something else entirely. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. 2 nights later, the sound of the mailbox clattering shut made me jump. It was close to midnight, rain still dripping from the eaves, the neighborhood silent except for the occasional gust rattling the branches. I opened the box with cold fingers and pulled out another unmarked envelope. No stamp, no name, just the same block lettering that had appeared before. Inside, Dr. Alina Morales is a fake. Real Morales lives in Oregon. Identity stolen. This is federal crime. A friend. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop glowing in the dark, fingers trembling on the keyboard. A few searches later, my stomach dropped. The real Dr. Alina Morales was indeed a respected scientist, hundreds of miles away, with zero connection to our state. Which meant the woman Deborah paraded into my backyard last week, clipboard in hand, rattling off environmental jargon, was an imposter. The implications were staggering. Professional identity theft, staged inspections, fake paperwork. This wasn't just HOA pettiness. This was fraud on a scale that should have landed someone in prison, and Deborah stood at the center of it. The next morning, Laura caught me staring out the window, eyes locked on a black sedan parked across the street. It had been there before, sometimes in the afternoon, sometimes late at night. Same plate, same angle, always with someone sitting inside. "Scott," she whispered, "they're watching us." Through the drizzle on the glass, I could just make out the silhouette, binoculars lifted, aimed straight at our front door. That image seared into me. This wasn't paranoia, it was surveillance, organized, deliberate. The following day, another envelope appeared. "Deborah has people watching your house. Document everything. Times, license plates. This is bigger than you realize. Next escalation coming. A friend." I started logging everything, pen scratching across a spiral notebook. Morning shift, 7 to 11. Afternoon shift, 2 to 6. Evening shift, 8 till midnight. Always the same car, always with a rotating cast inside, a blonde woman during the mornings, a man in a baseball cap in the afternoons, another figure at night. This wasn't neighborhood watch. This was rotation surveillance, the kind you'd expect from professionals with a budget. It felt surreal, standing in my own living room, documenting strangers who were documenting me. At 10:30 that morning, the doorbell rang. I hesitated before opening it, but curiosity outweighed fear. A thin woman in her 30s stood there, clutching a manila folder like it was a shield. She looked over her shoulder twice before speaking. "Mr. Turner, I probably shouldn't be here. My name's Anna Mitchell, HOA secretary." Her voice shook, but her eyes, they were searching mine, testing whether I could be trusted. "What Deborah's doing to you isn't right," she blurted. "She forced through emergency authority without member approval. That's against our bylaws." She pressed the folder into my hands. Inside were meeting minutes, scribbled notes, procedural irregularities that most neighbors would never even notice. Laura came down the hall, joining us as Anna stepped inside. She perched on the edge of the couch, nervous, like every second in our living room risked her job. "Deborah, been making calls, secret ones, talking about property development, timing, investment opportunities. Things no HOA president should be involved in." Her details were oddly specific, too specific, the kind of inside information you don't get from just typing minutes at a board meeting, and yet it all rang true. That evening, another anonymous note landed in our box. This one chilled me more than the rest. "Be careful who you trust. Anna Mitchell has access, but also an agenda. Not everyone is what they seem. A friend." I stared at the note, then back at the folder she'd given me. Was Anna helping me or feeding me breadcrumbs on Deborah's behalf? My chest tightened with paranoia. First Deborah, then the fake inspector, then the surveillance cars. Now even the person offering me help came with a warning label. By late afternoon, a county vehicle rolled into my driveway. Out stepped Inspector Jim Walsh, a man in his 50s with deep lines under his eyes, the kind of bureaucrat who looked worn down by too many years of paperwork and angry residents. "Mr. Turner," he said, his voice heavy, "we need to discuss your flood control modifications. Concerns have been raised." I walked him through everything, the permits, the impact studies, the approvals stamped with county seals. He flipped through them with a professional eye, nodding at each page. "These all look legitimate," he admitted. "But," his eyes flicked to his phone, screen lighting up with a message he didn't want me to see. "But there's pressure from HOA leadership. They want this reviewed." Pressure from an HOA? Since when did a neighborhood president wield influence over county enforcement? Walsh wouldn't look me in the eye. It was clear he didn't want to be here, but someone was pulling his strings. That night, Anna returned with photocopied documents. More evidence, more irregularities, emergency expenditures, consulting fees, legal retainers nobody else had signed off on. The deeper I looked, the uglier it got. Deborah wasn't just enforcing rules. She was bending the entire board around her will. But then Anna asked a question that froze me. "Scott, out of curiosity, what projects have you worked on in this region before? Any big ones? Any that might have involved developers?" Her tone was casual, but her eyes were sharp, measuring my reaction. I felt my skin prickle. Why would a secretary care about my professional history? I thought about it long after she left, about the way she seemed both nervous and too knowledgeable, about how the anonymous notes always came just as she appeared with her own intel, about how none of this, the fines, the fake documents, the surveillance, was random. And as the first storm warnings scrolled across the local news, Hurricane Helena forming in the Atlantic, I realized this was bigger than a personal feud. Something was being set in motion. And for the first time, I started to wonder if Anna was at the center of it. She leaned in close and said the words that made my head spin. "What if I told you I'm both?" For a moment, the rain outside sounded louder than it had any right to, a steady drum against the eaves, like a countdown I couldn't stop. Anna's eyes were empty of the nervousness I'd seen before. The tremor in her voice was gone. She looked like someone who'd been holding her breath for months and finally allowed herself to exhale. I remember the exact way she said it, whispered urgent as if the house could be listening. "I work for Deborah, I'm her secretary, but I'm also the one leaving you the notes." The words landed heavy. I had imagined any number of betrayals, fake consultants, bribed inspectors, but I hadn't imagined that my secret ally would be standing on my porch, pretending to be Deborah's inside woman while guiding me through the very trap she'd helped design. Outside, the street lamp flickered. The gate at the end of the lane groaned open. A truck idled too long at the corner. Small sounds, everyday suburban sounds, but they felt loaded with meaning now. Anna set the manila folder on my kitchen table and slid a photocopied page toward me like a relic. Board minutes, handwritten notes, a legal brief with a redacted phone number, a line circled in ink. Emergency authority granted unilateral decision. She tapped it like it was an answer to a prayer and a grenade at the same time. "Why?" I asked, the question blurted out before my brain could reframe it into something less raw. "Why pretend? Why not tell me outright?" She didn't look away, because if Deborah suspected, she'd never let me close. She'd bury the evidence, destroy the records, she'd change her behavior and ruin my chance to prove everything. Her hands were steady. I needed her to think I was loyal. I needed to be inside when she made the mistakes. It sounded like something from a movie. Long cons, double agents, theatrical deception. It didn't feel like a movie when Anna described the nights she sat in Deborah's office, pretending to alphabetize invoices while recording conversations on a phone hidden in a potted plant. It didn't feel fictional when she told me about the ledger entries she'd photographed, the bank deposits to an account owned by Meridian Construction, the recorded calls where Deborah talked about timing storms like they were scheduled events. She'd been collecting a mosaic of proof for 18 months. 18 months of pretending, listening, documenting. I thought of Laura asleep upstairs, the slow, steady rise and fall that usually soothed me. Tonight it felt fragile. "You say you've got evidence," I said. "Enough to take her down." Anna's mouth tightened. "I've got more than enough," she said. "But the system moves slow. Deborah moves fast. She's patient in a different way, a slow, poisonous patience. She'll force people out one by one, ruin them quietly, and then she'll stand in the wreckage smiling like she never touched a match." We talked until the light in the living room went dim and the clock on the wall tracked the hours with merciless honesty. She told me about Jennifer, her sister, the one who'd been destroyed by the same patterns, and the way Anna had watched a house sink under fines and humiliation until her sister's family split apart. She didn't cry when she spoke of it. Instead, she spoke in a voice that had learned to keep itself steady in case steadiness saved someone. The next morning, Deborah called an emergency community meeting. I had this image lodged in my head of a kindly woman convening neighbors in a church basement. Instead, when I stepped into the community center, it felt like walking into a small corporate AGM. Folding chairs lined up in perfect rows, a projector humming like an insect. handouts stacked on a table under fluorescent lights that made everyone's faces a little too honest. 51 people filled the room, more than I'd ever seen at a single HOA meeting, all of them waiting like an audience for the verdict. Deborah stood behind a podium, immaculate, her suit pressed, a glass of water sweating slightly beside her. She clicked the remote and the screen lit up with a presentation titled in clinical font, Unauthorized Hydraulic Modifications, Liability and Risk Assessment. The first slide was dramatic, a grainy photo of a catastrophic dam failure from decades ago, water roaring through a town like some biblical punishment. The soundtrack in my head was the projector fan and an expectant hush. She spoke with the kind of practiced authority that turns civilians into jurors. "I want to emphasize," she said, voice smooth as varnish, "that Mr. Turner's intentions were excellent, but good intentions do not absolve us of liability." She rolled out insurance charts, litigation scenarios, hypothetical worst cases that had the mathematical precision of a tax auditor and the aim of a prosecutor. Slide after slide made my flood control system sound like a slow-moving catastrophe that would bankrupt the whole neighborhood if it failed. During a break, the polite, obligatory bathroom break that gives people nervousness to spread, something was folded into my hand, a note. In the same block letters I'd been receiving, "Deborah is preparing to force neighborhood evacuation during Hurricane Helena. Property values crash 40%. Meridian buys cheap. Deborah gets commission." My stomach dropped as if I'd stepped off an invisible curb. It was the first time the fog cleared and an ugly shape appeared. This wasn't a single personal vendetta. This was an economy of catastrophe, a scheme where destruction had its own return on investment. I stood up when the meeting reconvened. My voice felt small, as if I were speaking through a straw. "Before we vote on anything," I said, "I want to share something about property manipulation schemes in flood-prone areas." The room breathed with the silence of people waiting to be led. I walked them through the basics, developers buying distressed properties, market crashes after disasters, how timing could mean the difference between a backyard salvage operation and a multi-million-dollar buyout. I tried not to let my technical language become a lecture. I tried to make the logic feel like a warning from a neighbor who'd watched the water line for decades. You could feel the room shift. Murmurs rose like surf. Mrs. Peterson clutched her handkerchief and asked if anyone had seen strange cars taking photographs. Mr. Williams mentioned offers from unknown buyers. Connections snapped into place like a string of lights being turned on. When I mentioned property manipulation, something in Deborah changed. Her face, that professional mask, flickered, and then snapped back into place so quickly it was almost animal. She attacked hard with words sharpened into accusation. "Scott Turner moved in here and started making changes without considering consequences," she hissed. "He's reckless. He put us at risk." There was hatred in her tone, not the abstract anger of someone defending policy, but the hot, personal venom you reserve for someone who has cost you something precious. It landed like a blow, and as I looked out over the faces of my neighbors, some confused, some skeptical, some quietly angry, I realized I'd opened a door that could not be closed. The question wasn't whether Deborah would use the hurricane. The question was how many people she would drag through the doorway with her. That night, long after the meeting emptied out and the projector glow was gone, I sat in my kitchen staring at another anonymous note. The ink was darker this time, pressed hard into the paper as if the writer's hand had been shaking with urgency. "This isn't about money. This is personal. Deborah wasn't always Deborah. Look up the 2020 Riverside luxury development. Check who wrote the environmental report that killed it. Check the engineer's name. You cost her $85,000 and 3 years of her life. She orchestrated your move here. She's been planning this since day one. A friend." The words blurred as I read them over and over until my coffee went cold beside me. My own name surfaced like a ghost from the past. Scott Turner, PE. I remembered that project. 3 years earlier, I'd written the environmental assessment that shut down Riverside luxury development. 47 condos planned for the wetlands along Willow Creek. My analysis had been unflinching. Unstable soil, catastrophic flood risk, habitat destruction. The county killed the deal based on my report. I had been proud of that. Proud to protect people, proud to prevent disaster. But pride doesn't feed a realtor's commission. Deborah had been their agent. I hadn't known her name then, she was Lewis at the time, but now the puzzle pieces rearranged into something horrifying. Her hatred wasn't about permits or neighborhood rules. It was revenge. Calculated, patient, personal. I opened old files on my laptop, fingers trembling as I searched. There it was, my signature stamped on the report. Every diagram, every risk calculation, every page that had choked the development into dust. The project had been worth millions. Deborah's cut would have been $85,000 plus the developer's future business. I hadn't just rejected paperwork. I had ruined her golden ticket. A creak by the window made me jump. Laura stood there, robe wrapped tight, her eyes tired but sharp. "Scott," she whispered, "why does she hate you this much?" I told her about Riverside, about the wetlands, about how my report had killed Deborah's biggest opportunity. Laura didn't speak for a long time. She just stood with her arms folded, listening to the rain peppering the glass. Finally, she said, "Then she brought us here on purpose." The thought landed with the weight of a confession. Our dream home hadn't been a lucky find. It had been bait. The realtor who had suddenly found this listing for us, the price that seemed too good, the way obstacles disappeared like magic, Deborah had steered us here like sheep into a pen. Within 48 hours of the meeting, neighbors who had defended me began receiving their own violation notices. Mrs. Peterson, fined for unauthorized gnome placement causing visual pollution. The Williams family, cited for excessive bird feeder activity. The Johnsons, fined for painting their mailbox the wrong shade of beige. Each violation more absurd than the last, each message clear. Stand with Scott Turner and you'll pay. I walked through the neighborhood one morning, boots crunching on wet gravel, and saw curtains twitching as I passed. People avoided my eyes. Mr. Williams mumbled a hello, but his wife tugged his sleeve, pulling him back inside. Fear had become contagious. Deborah had turned me into a warning sign. And then came the smaller things, the cuts meant to bleed me dry slowly. Sprinkler heads mysteriously bent until they flooded my driveway. Our mailbox knocked sideways again and again, until even the mail carrier sighed with annoyance. Garden beds trampled, just enough to make us look careless. Every morning, Laura checked for new damage with the quiet dread of someone waiting for the next bruise to bloom. Through it all, Anna remained steady, too steady. When I told her about the harassment, she nodded like she'd seen it before. "That's Deborah," she said. "She escalates, first the fines, then the property damage. It's how she isolates people." She said it with the calmness of a weather report. Her knowledge scared me more than her silence would have. How many times had she watched this same playbook unfold? How many families had she seen crushed under Deborah's system before mine? That evening, another note slid under my door, the handwriting as familiar as my own by now. "Document everything. Photos, timestamps, witnesses. Deborah always overreaches. Patience is your strongest weapon. A friend." Patience, it was a bitter word, but it resonated. I started photographing everything, the tilted mailbox, the footprints in the garden mud, the surveillance car parked in shifts outside. Each photo a puzzle piece. Each puzzle piece a small anchor to keep me from drowning in fear. 3 days later, Inspector Walsh returned. This time he wasn't the tired bureaucrat I'd met before. His voice was sharp, clipped. He demanded immediate removal of my flood system, waving an emergency order that reeked of Deborah's fingerprints. When I pressed him for specific violations, he snapped back with evasions, refusing to look me in the eye. That night, someone slipped bank records under my door. My blood went cold as I studied them. Walsh had been receiving regular deposits, $1,500 a month, from a shell company tied to Deborah's real estate network. 18 months of quiet bribes, always right after HOA board meetings. He wasn't just pressured, he was owned. The storm was still forming in the Atlantic, and yet in my kitchen I could already hear its echo, the slow build of something too big to stop. Deborah wasn't fighting me with rules anymore. She was wielding money, power, fear. And still, the anonymous notes kept coming. More urgent, more intimate. Someone was guiding me, whispering strategy through paper slips in the night. And as the winds picked up in the forecast, I began to wonder if this unseen ally had been planning Deborah's downfall just as carefully as she had been planning mine. Because patience, that word kept circling back, patience had become Deborah's weapon, and now it was mine. She asked me to let them flood the neighborhood. The sentence landed in the kitchen like a physical blow, louder than the storm warnings on the TV, sharper than the creak of the back gate in the wind. Anna said it without flinch, like laying out a chess move. "We let Deborah have your dam, Scott. We let Helena do what she will. Then we release everything, the bank records, the recordings, the surveillance. It will all fall apart." For a long minute I couldn't breathe. Letting water into people's houses to prove a point felt wrong in the marrow. I grew up building flood models that saved lives, not sacrificing them for spectacle. Laura, sitting across from me with a blanket around her shoulders, watched every expression as if I might decide to jump off a cliff. The rain on the roof sounded suddenly obscene, the steady tap-tap that sounded like a metronome counting down the hours. Anna laid out the timeline like an engineer explaining failure modes. Deborah wanted the dam down before Helena's landfall. Meridian had already staged equipment within reach. The fake emergency orders would force county crews to tear my system out in the darkness before the heaviest rains. Without the dam, Willow Creek would behave exactly as my models predicted. Streets would flood. Basements would take on water. Meridian's staging grounds would become a mud trap, swallowing their expensive cranes and trailers. It would be ugly, immediate, and visible. But it would also reveal a pattern of deliberate timing and coordination, proof that could not be hand-waved as coincidence. "How many families will suffer?" I asked, the question raw. I imagined faces, the houses I'd walked past that autumn, the neighbors who had offered cookies and cautious smiles. Mrs. Peterson, who kept her orchids like a private museum. Mr. Williams, who taught middle school math and fixed everyone's lawnmower. The calculus Anna proposed was horrifying. Short-term property damage versus long-term protection from a serial predator who destroyed lives for profit. "You're asking me to be a monster," I said. "You're asking me to be patient enough to expose a monster," Anna corrected, voice flat. There was a steadiness in her I hadn't fully understood until now, not grimness so much as an exhaustion that comes from watching injustice compound year after year. She unrolled a map, red pins marking Meridian equipment, blue pins where bank deposits hit Walsh's account, yellow dots where victims had been forced to sell. 18 months of evidence. 67 recorded conversations. Ledger entries that lined up with board votes. Every breadcrumb in a trail that led straight to Deborah. We made lists, document everything. Cameras at the dam, microphones in places Deborah would never suspect, time-stamped geotagged photos, witnesses on standby. Anna's equipment arrived, small cameras that could pass for birdhouses, recorders tiny enough to hide in a toolbox. The kind of gear that belonged in spy novels, not in suburban squabbles. She taught me how to set them up with the clinical calm of someone who had rehearsed this loneliness until it stopped feeling lonely. Neighbors called that afternoon, panic in their voices. "They told us to evacuate," Mrs. Peterson cried. "What about the kitten?" Mr. Williams wanted help sandbagging a basement. Each call was a knife. Each voicemail stacked on top of the other like a ledger of guilt. Laura took them, soft and practical, coordinating who could go help where, which houses had elderly residents that needed a ride to higher ground. I watched her move through the neighborhood like someone walking a battlefield, offering towels and shovels, while my hands trembled with the knowledge that I had to let this happen. That night I walked the perimeter of the dam one last time. The wind smelled of salt and rain. The water lapped quietly against the banks, deceptively calm. I ran a hand along the concrete lip, feeling the roughness of work I'd poured into this project for months. There were smudges of dried mud where kids had played last summer, a cigarette butt wedged in a crack from some late-night smoker. I thought of every small, human thing that collective safety had once protected. Letting it go felt like betrayal. At dawn, the demolition crew arrived with county trucks and public works men who glanced at their orders like reluctant soldiers. Their boots left wet prints along the driveway. Cameras from Channel 7 were already in position. Deborah had timed this to be a show. She stood by the staging area with a microphone clipped to her lapel, the kind of bright smile politicians practice in the mirror. "We are protecting the community," she said to the reporter, voice warm and staged. Behind her, men in hard hats prepared to dismantle the gates and fill the retention ponds. I stood on my deck and filmed, not because I wanted to capture my ruin, but because Anna had insisted, document everything, even your own heartbreak. My hands were steady only when the camera was on. Shame and adrenaline focused the lens. Workers had to cut through reinforced steel, haul away control panels, unbolt the automatic gates that had sealed tight during storms. The hydraulic gates groaned like a beast being muzzled. Deborah narrated for the cameras, painting the scene in legalese and fear, making my contribution look reckless and amateurish. Every word she said would later be played against her recorded admissions. By mid-afternoon, clouds thickened into the kind of bruise you see before winter storms. Channel 7's ticker announced Hurricane Helena's projected landfall in fewer than 24 hours, and messages began coming in. Flooded basements, neighbors mobilizing, volunteers with sandbags. The first real rain arrived in sheets, and Willow Creek swelled like a living thing, restless and hungry. Calls started at 4:30 p.m. Mrs. Peterson wept into the phone. "It's in my basement, Scott. It's in the living room." Mr. Williams shouted the street name, his voice breaking. Each voice was a wound I'd helped open. I told them I was coming, that I would do everything I could to help, and then I went back to the equipment Anna had instructed me to hide. A camera pointed at Meridian's staging area, an audio recorder near Deborah's office window, timestamps synced to the county orders. The water rose exactly where my models had said it would. It crept past sidewalks, curled around mailboxes, filled driveways with the brown sheen of stormwater. I watched from the second-story window as a neighbor fought to save a chest freezer, a husband dragging furniture, a child clutching a stuffed animal like a talisman against chaos. The guilt burned in my chest, a fierce, acid flame. But so did a different heat, the slow, growing heat of righteousness that comes from knowing you are about to reveal a truth that will stop future harm. As the creek breached and the neighborhood became a geometry of floating furniture and bobbing lawn chairs, I pressed record on my smallest device and walked out into the rain. My shirt soaked through almost immediately, mud ballooned around my boots. I filmed the Meridian trailers, cameras catching their cranes listing in the new, unexpected lake. I filmed Deborah on the bank, shouting into a phone as if calling the victory lap before everything collapsed. I filmed neighbors sobbing and strangers passing out towels, and the volunteer rescue teams hosing a soaked dog. The moment felt obscene and holy at once, a tableau of human ruin and human courage. I kept filming because the footage would be evidence, and because sometimes the only way to survive a terrible choice is to make sure it becomes useful for something beyond your own conscience. In the wind and rain, with my hands numb, I thought about patience again, about the strange moral math Anna had asked me to accept. She said patience was a weapon. Tonight it felt like a scalpel, precise, clinical, cutting into a tumor that had been growing in plain sight. We were about to see if precision could outweigh pain, if revealing a predator would be worth the temporary wreckage of so many lives. And so I walked through the water, camera in hand, feeling every step like an accounting, a ledger of what we were willing to lose to make sure this never happened again. The storm had a sound all its own, not just wind, not just rain, but a low, grinding roar that rattled through the windows and floorboards. By midnight, Helena was fully upon us. Trees bent sideways, shingles tore loose, and somewhere down the street, a transformer blew with a flash that lit up the neighborhood like a war zone. The dam was gone, dismantled piece by piece hours earlier, and now Willow Creek moved like it had been waiting for this moment its whole life. I stood at the upstairs window, camera rolling, as water funneled through the empty basin where my flood gates once stood. It poured into backyards, surged across streets, swallowed fences whole. Cars bobbed like toys, alarms blaring in discordant cries that cut through the storm. It wasn't a flood anymore. It was a spectacle. Deborah was out there. Even through the sheets of rain, I could see her umbrella, black and oversized, held high above her perfect hair. She barked into her phone, the glow of her screen reflecting off her face like some stage light. Every now and then she gestured toward Meridian's equipment yard, where cranes and backhoes sat half-submerged, their million-dollar investments dissolving into the stormwater. She didn't look at the neighbors wadding chest-deep through their own lawns. She didn't look at the families being ferried into rescue boats. Her eyes were locked on that staging yard, like a gambler watching chips slide off the table. Inside, Laura moved like a soldier. She turned the living room into a supply station, towels, bottled water, flashlights, dry clothes. When neighbors knocked, she ushered them in, no hesitation, even as the floor turned muddy from soaked shoes. Mrs. Peterson huddled on our couch, her orchids ruined. The Williams kids sat on the rug, wrapped in blankets, their eyes wide with shock. Laura whispered comfort while I documented chaos. She was saving people. I was recording proof. Around 2 a.m., a text buzzed on my phone from Anna. Check recorder 3, Deborah slipped, big. My stomach tightened. Recorder 3 was the one hidden outside the community center window, where Deborah often took late-night calls. I loaded the file with shaking hands, plugging in headphones as the storm hammered the roof above me. Her voice came through clear, even over static. Confident, cocky. Yes, the dam's down. Helena's going to do the rest. Meridian will be ready to scoop the properties next month. The flood map will scare them off. 30% below market, guaranteed. Tell them my commission stands. No liability. Walsh handled it. He's been paid. Each sentence was a nail in her coffin. The timing, the collusion, the bribes, the property scheme, it was all there. Anna had been right. Patience. Let Deborah talk long enough, and she would carve her own confession into the air. At dawn, the storm broke. The silence afterward was worse than the noise. Streets looked like canals, lawns like swamps. The smell of wet wood and gasoline hung heavy. Neighbors wandered in shock, some carrying trash bags of whatever they'd managed to save. I walked with the camera still rolling, filming the water line etched high on houses, the mud clinging to curtains in shattered windows. And then, a moment I'll never forget, Deborah arriving in a pristine SUV, tires splashing through puddles, face composed as if she were showing up for a business luncheon. She gathered a cluster of soaked neighbors, putting on her practiced empathy, promising emergency funds and temporary housing. But her voice cracked once, just once, when she noticed Channel 7 setting up again. Reporters, cameras, microphones. Anna appeared at my side, soaked to the bone but smiling for the first time since I'd met her. She doesn't know yet, she whispered. She doesn't know we've got it all on record. I wanted to feel triumph, but all I felt was tired. I looked at the Petersons, ruined furniture piled on their lawn, at the Williams kids clutching each other in silence, at Laura wringing out her sweater after spending all night keeping people alive. Victory felt hollow in that moment. Still, I pressed the camera's red button one last time and pointed it toward Deborah. The lens caught her perfect smile, the mud streaking the tires of her SUV, the background of a neighborhood she'd tried to sacrifice for her own gain. And I thought, this is the moment everything changes. But what Anna said next chilled me. Her voice was calm, almost too calm. Scott, we're not done. This storm was just Act 1. Deborah has bigger plans, and I'm not sure you understand just how far she's willing to go. And just like that, the silence after the storm didn't feel like peace. It felt like the pause before something worse. The morning after Helena, the neighborhood looked like a battlefield. Mud caked every driveway. Piles of ruined furniture stood like tombstones at the curb. The air smelled of mildew, gasoline, and something metallic, that faint tang of defeat. Neighbors walked slowly, dazed, voices low as if speaking too loudly might shatter what little calm remained. I was out with a shovel clearing muck from our front steps when I heard it, the faint creak of the gate down the street, followed by heavy boots squelching through wet gravel. Deborah's SUV appeared, spotless as always, idling in the wreckage like a shark circling a wounded school of fish. She stepped out in fresh heels, not a speck of mud on them, clipboard tucked under one arm. The audacity made my chest burn. Scott, she said, her tone as syrupy as ever. I hope you and Laura are holding up, such a tragedy, but you know. She tilted her head, eyes sharp as glass. You really should have complied when you had the chance. Imagine how different things could have been. I gripped the shovel handle until my knuckles turned white. Behind her, neighbors shuffled, listening. She wasn't talking to me, she was performing, spinning the story, painting me as the reckless fool who defied the HOA and doomed everyone else. But she didn't know what we had. That afternoon, Anna arrived with her usual manila folders, this time bulging with printouts, transcripts, and flash drives. She spread them across my kitchen table, hands steady, eyes alight with something I hadn't seen before, hunger. This, she said, tapping the stack, is enough to bury her. Laura hovered by the counter, arms folded, still muddy from helping neighbors haul debris. She looked at Anna the way someone looks at medicine that might also be poison. Are you sure? She asked. Anna didn't hesitate. Bribes, falsified inspections, property manipulation schemes, and now recorded proof of intent. Any prosecutor with half a brain will take this case. I wanted to believe her. God, I did, but something gnawed at me. The way Anna spoke, the precision of her timing, the fact that every envelope had arrived just when I needed it most. That night, as the neighborhood slept in damp houses with box fans roaring, I listened again to Deborah's recorded call. Her words cut like blades, each one a confession. And yet, something was off. Why had she been so careless? Why speak so openly about bribes and commissions, knowing she was always under scrutiny? Unless someone had wanted her caught, unless the trap wasn't mine at all. The thought made my skin prickle. 2 days later, the county held a press conference. Deborah stood at the podium, polished and smiling, flanked by Walsh and 2 other officials. She spun the disaster as unforeseen, blaming unauthorized modifications, me for making the flooding worse. The cameras ate it up. Then, in the middle of her speech, a journalist shouted, "What about the Meridian construction payments? What about your recorded call?" Deborah froze just for a second, but the cameras caught it. The facade cracked. She snapped back with denial, but the seed had been planted. Questions erupted. Walsh fumbled his notes. And in that chaos, I saw it, Anna, standing near the back, phone in hand, recording, eyes locked not on Deborah but on me. Watching my reaction, measuring it. That evening she came by again, voice low, urgent. "It's working. The media's circling. Walsh is panicking. Deborah's cornered." She leaned in close, her whisper sharp enough to cut. "But don't think this ends with her. Meridian doesn't lose gracefully, and Deborah isn't the kind to go down alone." Her words settled in my chest like ice, because she was right. That night, Laura asked me the question I'd been avoiding. "Scott, do you trust her?" I wanted to say yes. Anna had saved me, guided me, armed me with evidence. But another voice whispered she'd also orchestrated every step. Every note, every reveal, every dramatic twist. Was she saving me or using me? I lay awake long after Laura drifted off, listening to the faint hum of a generator down the street, the croak of frogs in the swollen creek. Somewhere out there, Deborah was scrambling, fighting, plotting. But Anna's words haunted me more than Deborah's smile. Because storms pass, floods recede. But secrets linger. And I couldn't shake the feeling that Anna's secret was the one that would drown me in the end. The courthouse steps smelled like wet concrete and cheap coffee, a taste of the town's exhaustion. Cameras clustered like gulls, flashlights of attention hungry for the next drama. I held Laura's hand and felt the tremor in her fingers match my own. For 3 nights I'd slept badly, the memory of water in living rooms, the sound of kids crying, the weight of choices pressing on my chest like a wet blanket. And now we were here, waiting for the rest of the world to see what Anna had been building in secret for 18 months. They played the tapes in court like a slow, surgical strike. Deborah's voice, confident, clipped, casual about bribes and plans, floated through the hall, undeniable, recorded, time-stamped. The prosecutor let the recordings breathe, then stacked the bank records and the emails like plates on a table. Meridian's invoices, Walsh's checks. The emergency orders signed and faxed in the dead of night. The judge listened with that patient face that asks you to tell the truth even when it hurts. When Deborah was led away in cuffs, she didn't scream or beg. She looked at me once, and in that glance I saw an animal that had been cornered for too long, not apologetic, not human, just furious. Her shoes scuffed the courthouse steps like punctuation. Cameras clicked. Lives shifted. There was a cheer somewhere at the edge of the square, low and hesitant, like a sparrow finding its voice after a storm. But the real work was quieter. Feds moved in with clipboards and hard faces. Walsh's desk was cleared out. His face turned gray under fluorescent lights as agents asked him to explain deposits and meetings. Meridian stopped taking management calls. Subpoenas were served at dawn, surfacing layers of people who'd treated ethics like a flexible suggestion. The HOA board, the same body that had cheered Deborah's theatrics, folded back into itself and folded out again with new faces, volunteers who wanted nothing to do with power games. Anna testified like someone carrying the weight of a lifetime. Her voice never cracked. She read transcripts of calls where Deborah laughed about property values and whispered victory plans. The sound of that laughter in the recording made the judge pause. Even recorded, it carried the cruelty in it. People asked me over and over whether I felt relief, whether I felt vindicated. I searched for those feelings like for a missing boot after a flood and found them muddied by exhaustion. We won in the bluntest legal sense. Deborah would be prosecuted. Walsh would be investigated. Meridian would answer for staging equipment and suspicious payments. But there were basements still damp with muddy furniture, elderly neighbors whose insurance wouldn't cover everything, kids who'd been pulled out of their rooms in pajamas and would remember that fear for years. The victory felt gilded against that ruin. Anna came to our porch one evening after the televised hearings wound down but before the sentencing. Her hair hung heavy with rain, as if the weather still clung to her. She looked older than she had in the early frantic days of notes and hidden recorders. Her smile was small. She handed me an envelope, the last of the evidence she'd kept under lock and key. Inside were letters from her sister, photographs of a house gone, court filings that read like one unending complaint. She breathed and said softly, "I didn't want your life like that. I wanted a different life for my sister. I wanted to stop her from becoming one more story. I wanted to say thank you. I wanted to say I understood. Instead, I said the truth. You built a case," I said. "You saved us, but you asked me to watch people drown to make it happen." Her eyes were honest. "I asked for a terrible thing," she admitted, "and I take that with me. I'll live with it." She paused, looking down at her hands, at the calluses that had long ago learned to hold a pen and a secret. "Do what you can to help them rebuild." So we did. Laura and I went house to house for weeks, pulling soggy rugs into the street, hauling ruined drywall to the curb, running errands for neighbors whose cars were still underwater. The work was not cinematic. It was sweat. It was loading a trailer at 6 in the morning and coming home at dusk. It was the sound of a chainsaw cutting out rotten floor joists, the sandpaper rasp of restoration. There were quiet afternoons when Mrs. Peterson sat on our porch and told me about the orchids she thought she'd lost. She'd cry sometimes and then laugh, small and shocked, like a person discovering they still had a voice. Insurance paid some of the bills. Class action suits recovered others. The county allocated emergency funds after pressure from national news outlets and angry town halls. Meridian filed for bankruptcy protection in the local paper's business section, a dry paragraph about cranes and mortgage-backed plans that had swallowed more than cash. Deborah's conviction came with restitution payments that trickled into an account, not nearly enough to erase the nights people had sat on soggy mattresses and memorized the sound of rain. In time, the HOA bylaws were rewritten. We elected neighbors who'd never run for office before, teachers, a nurse, a retired mechanic. They learned to say no to prestige and yes to transparency. The monthly meetings moved from polished presentations to honest ones, to minutes that included receipts and bank statements and a rule that any developer contact had to be logged and published. It was small. It was tedious. It was necessary. I stood one autumn afternoon on the new concrete lip of a rebuilt retention pond, the place fenced and approved, legal in every line and stamped in the county's ink. Children played near the path, and a dog splashed at the edge under a dad's careful eye. The creek moved steady and indifferent, the way water does when given room to breathe. I traced the edge with a thumb and felt the scarred memory of all that had happened, and the satisfaction of something rebuilt properly. People asked me if I regretted the decision to let the flood happen. I never gave a simple answer. How do you weigh the tear of a single night against the prevention of years of suffering? How do you measure the cost of a family forced to sell for pennies against the cost of dozens of families being destroyed, one by one, over a decade? Numbers feel small next to faces. What stayed with me was this: the people who'd been hurt forgave in small, human increments. They forgave when someone helped tow out a ruined car. They forgave when Laura brought casseroles and stayed to mop. They forgave when the HOA paid to replace an elderly couple's carpet. The community didn't come back like it had been. It came back like something remade, not unbroken, but wiser and more watchful. Anna left town 6 months later. She sent a postcard from a place I couldn't quite place. The note was short. "Justice happened, I'm sorry, take care of them." I never asked where she went. Curiosity felt greedy. I thought about calling her sometimes to ask the questions I'd told myself to avoid. Did she sleep at night? Could she live with the knowledge of the faces she'd watched flood? Had it been worth the cost? Sometimes, late at night, Laura wakes me and we lie in the dark listening to a far-off rain. I feel the weight of that night press into my ribs, the echoes of splashing water and Anna's calm voice. I feel the soft, steady hand of my wife in mine and remember the look on Mrs. Peterson's face when she handed me cookies the week before the first fine. I remember Deborah's laugh on tape and the hollow victory that played across Channel 7. I remember the small good things, neighbors' hands lifting sod, a carpenter who volunteered his Friday afternoon to repair a porch step, the kid who brought a wet stuffed bear to our door and asked if we could dry it. If there is a lesson, it is not tidy. Justice is not always clean. Patience can be a weapon, but it can also be a wound you carry. Sometimes doing the right thing requires choices that make you ache. And sometimes, when you choose the hard path, you must also be ready to repair the break you helped create. My engineering reports are back on my desk, updated, public. I speak at county meetings now, often invited, always careful with my tone. I teach neighbors how to read flood maps, how to take photos that matter, how to hold a board accountable. The dam we built, the legal one, stands there now, quiet, doing its job without fanfare. Kids' laughter echoes off its banks on summer afternoons. The creek keeps moving, and with it the slow business of living. Late one evening, long after the trials and the ribbons on the newly rebuilt park, I found another envelope in the mailbox. No return address. The handwriting was familiar, steady, and plain. Inside, a single sentence. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who stay silent the longest. I folded the paper and tucked it into my wallet. I didn't know who had written it for certain. Maybe Anna, maybe someone else. Maybe no one at all. But as I looked out over the creek, where the water ran clean and people walked dogs and the sky had the honest light of evening, I felt something like peace. Not because everything had been perfect, but because we had chosen to rebuild the right way, clumsy, human, and together. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one. The truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.